I remember the exact smell of damp concrete in the barracks that night at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, because it mixed with the copper tang of blood seeping through my uniform shirt. It was not from training, not from any drill or obstacle course. It was from fists and boots that belonged to men who were supposed to be my brothers in arms. I had been in the Army less than a year, barely 20 years old, and I thought the discipline and structure I craved would finally protect me from the chaos of home. Instead, I found myself on the floor, ribs aching with every breath my cheek pressed to the cold tiles as muffled laughter echoed off the walls. They left me there broken and humiliated, and the silence afterward was louder than their taunts. I forced myself to sit up, wiping at my face, and in the fluorescent light, I saw streaks of red staining the olive fabric on my sleeve. In that moment, I realized my stepmother Carla had found a way to reach me even here on a military base hundreds of miles from Charleston. She was not physically present, but her shadow stretched across my life through her cousin Corporal Dunn. He was one of the men who had just shoved me against the wall, and I knew from the smug look on his face that the cover-up had already begun. Carla had always protected her own and discarded me, but now she was doing it with the authority of a uniform. The rage that boiled inside me was not just from the beating, it was from the realization that the family abuse I had run from had followed me into the one place I thought would save me. I staggered to the sink and splashed water on my face, staring at the reflection of someone I barely recognized. My eyes were swollen, my lips split, but worse than that was the flicker of fear I saw looking back. Fear had never been part of my plan when I signed my enlistment papers. At home, fear was how Carla controlled me, how she made my father Richard look the other way, how she elevated her daughter Victoria while I was treated like an outsider. I joined the Army because I wanted to bury that powerless version of myself. Yet here I was, alone in the barracks, bloodied and silenced by the same tactics gaslight cover-up isolation. When Corporal Dunn leaned in earlier, pressing his voice low so only I could hear his words cut deeper than the blows. "You think anyone's going to believe you? My family donates, my Aunt Carla makes calls. You are nothing. Keep your mouth shut if you value what little you've got." Those words rang in my head long after he walked out. I gripped the edges of the sink until my knuckles went white. For a second, I thought about calling my dad, but I already knew what he would say. He would hesitate, then Carla would take the phone and spin the story until somehow I was the problem. She had been covering for Victoria for years, lying, twisting, making me feel invisible. Now she was doing it again with Dunn and his friends. I had sworn to myself I would never let her define me again, but tonight it felt like her reach was endless. I sank onto the bench at the end of the barracks hallway, clutching my side where the bruise was already blooming. Every breath hurt, but I forced myself to stay awake, to stay present. My training had taught me that discipline is a weapon and that survival is a choice made moment by moment. If I closed my eyes now, I would slip back into the helpless girl Carla had wanted me to remain. Instead, I whispered to myself the words that had carried me through boot camp: "Stand up, Hayes. Stand up again." That night was the moment I understood two things with absolute clarity. First, that the abuse was no longer just about family jealousy or favoritism. It was about control, about silencing me completely, about turning me into an expendable soldier whose suffering could be buried under paperwork and donations. Second, that I would not stay silent. Not here. Not anymore. The military had given me tools. Carla had underestimated the daughter she despised. She thought I would fold under pressure the way my father always had. But she had overlooked one thing. My training had not made me weaker. It had taught me strategy, patience, and how to strike back when the time was right. As I sat there bruised and shaking, I made myself a promise. If they wanted to turn the barracks into a battlefield, I would fight it like one. Not with fists or screams, but with evidence, tactics, and timing. They had drawn first blood. They had dragged my stepmother's shadow into Fort Bragg. They thought fear would break me. Instead, it forged the beginning of a war they could not imagine. If you have ever seen the truth buried to protect the guilty, then you know the fury that was building inside me. I knew then that this was not just about me. It was about every soldier who had been told to shut up, every daughter who had been dismissed as unworthy. I would carry their voices with mine, and one day soon, Carla Dunn and everyone who thought silence could protect them would learn what happens when a Marine's daughter refuses to stay quiet. When I was 9 years old, Charleston, South Carolina smelled like saltwater and magnolia blossoms, but inside our home it smelled like resentment. My mother had passed away when I was 6, and for a while it was just me and my father, Richard. He was a quiet man, an Army veteran himself, who worked long hours at the shipyard and came home tired but gentle. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with him coloring pictures while he tried to fix a broken toaster. Those moments felt safe, like the world couldn't touch me. But safety in my life never lasted long. 2 years later, he remarried. Carla arrived in my life like a storm front, beautiful on the outside, all sharp cheekbones and polished smiles, but cold beneath the surface. She brought with her a daughter, Victoria, who was only a year older than me. I wanted to believe we could be sisters. On the first day they moved in, I ran up to Victoria's room with one of my dolls and asked if she wanted to play. She wrinkled her nose, glanced at Carla, and said, "Why would I play with you?" "You're not really family." Carla smiled instead of correcting her. That was the beginning of the slow erasure of my place in my own home. Carla was an expert in small humiliations. At dinner, she would heap mashed potatoes on Victoria's plate and scrape the spoon along mine like she was rationing for a stranger. On birthdays, Victoria's gifts were wrapped in shiny bows, while mine were stuffed into grocery bags like an afterthought. I learned early that Carla's affection was a currency I would never afford. My father, caught between his new wife and his only daughter, chose silence. His silence was worse than her cruelty. One memory still burns like fire. On my 15th birthday, the driveway was decorated with balloons and streamers. I thought, just for once, maybe it was for me. When a brand new red sedan rolled up, Victoria squealed and jumped into Carla's arms. "Surprise!" Carla shouted, holding up the keys. It wasn't my surprise at all. That day, Victoria got a car, while I got a $10 gift card tucked into a plain envelope. I stood there holding it in my hand, surrounded by laughter that didn't include me, and felt something inside me harden. I didn't cry in front of them. I never gave them that satisfaction. But later that night, in the dark of my room, I made a vow. I would get out. I would build a life where Carla's approval no longer determined my worth. That's when the Army started whispering to me. Not literally, of course, but every recruiting poster I passed, every soldier in uniform I glimpsed in town, it all looked like freedom, structure, discipline, a way to escape the suffocating weight of a house that never felt like mine. While Victoria was planning shopping trips and college tours funded by Carla's connections, I was secretly practicing push-ups on my bedroom floor and running laps around the block. My future would not be handed to me wrapped in shiny bows. I would earn it with sweat and determination. By the time I turned 17, I was meeting quietly with a recruiter. I didn't tell Carla. I didn't even tell my dad. Part of me hoped he'd stop me, that he'd finally choose me over her. But deep down, I knew better. His loyalty had shifted long ago. When I finally signed my enlistment papers at 18, I remember walking out of the office with a pen still warm in my hand, my heart pounding with something I hadn't felt in years: control. Back home, Carla sneered when she found out. "The Army perfect. Now someone else can deal with your attitude." She said it in front of my father, daring him to contradict her. He didn't. But I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of pride, quickly smothered. That flicker was enough to keep me moving forward. Looking back now, I understand why my stepmother hated me. I was living proof that no matter how hard she tried, she could never erase the woman who came before her, my real mother. And Carla was determined to bury every trace of her. But the Army would give me a new name, a new identity, one that Carla couldn't touch. At least, that's what I thought. Carla's control grew sharper as I got older, like a knife honed with every passing year. By the time I was 16, the house in Charleston no longer felt like a home, but a stage where every scene was written to feature Victoria in the spotlight while I was cast as the unwanted extra. At school events, Carla would arrive dressed to perfection, her arm linked with Victoria's as though they were royalty. I trailed behind invisible carrying bags or folding chairs, never once introduced to teachers or parents. "This is my daughter, Victoria," she would beam, pausing just long enough for people to wonder who I was, then changing the subject before anyone asked. It was a deliberate act of erasure. Birthdays and holidays followed the same script. Victoria always received the expensive gifts, the cameras flashing as she tore through wrapping paper while Carla clapped. I would unwrap socks, notebooks, or worse, nothing at all. On Christmas morning, when Victoria unwrapped a brand new laptop, Carla turned to me with a smirk and said, "You can share if you need to." My father, Richard, sat in his recliner, silent as always, sipping coffee and pretending not to see. His silence was betrayal wrapped in indifference, and I hated it almost more than Carla's cruelty. One night after dinner, I overheard Carla on the phone with a neighbor. "Amanda is not cut out for college. She's moody, distracted, and frankly not very bright. But Victoria, she's Ivy League material." Her voice carried down the hallway as if she wanted me to hear. That was her way. Every insult was both a whisper and a knife cutting deep while pretending to be casual. Victoria thrived in the environment Carla created, not because she earned it, but because every obstacle was cleared for her. Tutors, dance lessons, a new car at 15, all gifts wrapped in privilege. I survived in the margins, working part-time at a diner to pay for my own clothes and books. The contrast between us was a constant reminder that in Carla's world, I would always be second, always the reminder of a life she wanted erased. But that unfairness lit a fire in me. At night, I would lie in bed listening to Victoria laugh with her friends, and I would imagine myself in a uniform marching across a training field where nobody cared who my stepmother was. The Army represented something Carla could never control: merit, discipline, rank, earned by sweat, not favoritism. I started training in secret. While Victoria slept in on Saturdays, I woke up at dawn to run along the battery, the ocean breeze stinging my face as I pushed my body harder with every mile. I memorized calisthenics routines, studied nutrition, and tested myself against the standards I had read about in recruiting pamphlets. Every drop of sweat was a rebellion against the life Carla had scripted for me. The final push came at a college fair in my senior year. Carla arrived with Victoria, of course, steering her toward the booths for Yale and Princeton. I walked alone to the Army recruiter's table. The sergeant standing there shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye. "You look like you've got grit," he said. No one in my own family had ever said that to me. I signed up for the entry exam without hesitation. When I told Carla later, her laugh was sharp and cruel. "Of course, military is perfect for someone like you. Too rough around the edges for real success." I stared at her across the kitchen table, my fists clenched under the surface, and said quietly, "At least I won't be bought." For the first time in years, she didn't have a quick comeback. My father sat frozen, his gaze fixed on his coffee cup, unwilling to intervene. But in that silence, I felt stronger than I ever had. The Army would not only be my escape, it would be my defiance, my proof that Carla had not broken me, that no amount of erasure could stop me from carving my own place in the world. The summer before I left for basic training in Fort Jackson was the longest and most suffocating of my life. Carla treated it like a countdown to her victory, convinced the Army would chew me up and spit me out. Every dinner became another performance where she predicted my failure. "You'll be back within a month," she told me one evening, swirling her wine as if she were reading from a script. "Girls like you don't last in a man's world." Victoria smirked from across the table, already bragging about her college acceptance letters, while my father sat silent as usual. His silence had become a wall I no longer tried to climb. I listened not with despair, but with the steady calm of someone who had already chosen a different path. I knew Carla's words were meant to wound, but they only hardened my resolve. I spent those last weeks working doubles at the diner, saving money for what little I could take with me. Every time I walked into that greasy kitchen, every time I refilled a cup of coffee for a stranger, I whispered to myself, "One step closer." Late at night after my shifts, I ran through the quiet Charleston streets, lungs burning, legs aching, but mind clear. Those runs became my ritual, my way of proving to myself that endurance was my weapon. No matter what Carla said, no matter what silence my father chose, I would carry myself into a new life. The day I shipped out, Carla didn't bother to drive me. She sent me off with a clipped "good luck" like she was dismissing me from her stage. Victoria didn't even look up from her phone. My father hugged me briefly, a stiff pat on the back that carried both pride and regret, though he said nothing. I carried that hug like a ghost as I boarded the bus, my duffel heavy, but my spirit lighter than it had ever been. For the first time, I felt like I was walking away from the chains of Charleston towards something that was mine alone. Basic training at Fort Jackson was brutal, but it was the brutality I had chosen. The heat, the drills, the constant orders, they stripped away everything I had known and replaced it with discipline, endurance, and a sense of belonging I had never felt at home. I remember standing in formation one morning, sweat dripping down my face, my body trembling with exhaustion, and thinking, this is where I begin. For once, I wasn't the unwanted stepchild or the invisible daughter. I was Private Hayes, equal in line, my worth measured by effort and resilience, not Carla's disdain. Yet even in that triumph, Carla found her way in. Letters arrived addressed in her neat handwriting, disguised as motherly concern but dripping with poison. "Hope you're surviving, though I imagine they're regretting taking you," she wrote. I crumpled those letters and tossed them in the trash, refusing to let her voice follow me into the field. Each time I rejected her words, I felt another cord between us snap. I had lived too long with her shadow looming over me. Now every push-up, every march, every blister was proof that I belonged to myself. When graduation day came, I stood in my pressed uniform, the sun hot on the parade ground, and looked out at the families in the bleachers. Carla and Victoria didn't show. My father came alone wearing a wrinkled shirt and an uncertain smile. For the first time in years, he looked at me without Carla's shadow between us. His eyes welled up as he saluted me awkwardly from the stands, and in that moment, I forgave him, not for Carla, not for the years of silence, but because I knew I didn't need his defense anymore. I had built my own armor. As the ceremony ended and I marched off with my unit, I felt the Charleston girl disappear behind me. I was no longer the outsider begging for scraps at a table where I never belonged. I was a soldier standing tall in a world where discipline and courage counted more than Carla's lies. I thought I had finally severed the last tie to her control. I had no idea then that her reach would stretch even into Fort Bragg and that the real battle had only just begun. Arriving at Fort Bragg felt like stepping into another universe. The sprawling base stretched for miles, a maze of barracks, training fields, and motor pools buzzing with life. For the first time in my 20 years, I was surrounded by people who did not know my past, who had never heard of Carla or Victoria, who didn't look at me as less than before I even spoke. I breathed in the humid Carolina air and told myself this is my second chance. The cadence of boots on pavement during morning formation became a rhythm that steadied me. The call of the drill sergeants, harsh and unforgiving, sounded like liberation compared to Carla's cutting whispers. Sweat poured down my back during PT runs, and every ache in my muscles felt like proof that I was rebuilding myself from the ground up. I wasn't the unwanted daughter anymore. I was Private Hayes. I thrived in the structure. Where Carla had made rules to keep me small, the Army gave me standards to rise toward. I threw myself into marksmanship training, into the discipline of the rifle range where everything came down to breath and focus. When I hit expert marksman on my first qualification, I felt a surge of pride so strong I had to swallow back tears. My squad mates slapped me on the back, grinning, and for once the smiles didn't feel like pity or mockery, they felt like respect. I told myself this was where I belonged, that the ghosts of Charleston couldn't follow me here. But shadows have long arms. Carla's voice found its way into Fort Bragg sooner than I expected. It began with subtle shifts. A captain pulled me aside after a briefing, his tone polite but cold. "Private Hayes, we've received some concerns about your emotional stability. Are you sure you're managing well?" I blinked, confused. "Yes, sir," I answered quickly. He gave me a look that suggested he didn't believe me, then dismissed me. The questions kept coming. A counselor called me in saying my stepmother had reached out to the family liaison officer. She expressed worry. The counselor said carefully that you might be struggling with grief, unresolved anger from losing your mother. My stomach twisted. This wasn't concern. This was sabotage dressed up as sympathy. Carla knew exactly how to frame her poison. She never called me unstable directly. She suggested I was vulnerable, struggling in need of guidance. Those words stuck like burrs, soft enough to sound caring, sharp enough to damage my reputation. I noticed the way some of my fellow soldiers started keeping their distance, the way whispers lingered after I walked past. I had fought my whole life to escape Carla's control, but somehow she had managed to slip into my record to infect the way others saw me. Still, I held on to the feeling that had carried me through basic, the belief that I could outwork any lie. I stayed late in the gym, ran extra laps after formation, volunteered for duties nobody wanted. I thought if I was relentless enough, if I proved myself again and again, the whispers would fade. For a while, it worked. My platoon sergeant nodded approvingly. My peers started relying on me during field exercises. Yet beneath the surface, I could sense a trap being built, one where no matter how hard I worked, Carla's shadow was waiting to drag me down. The first time I heard Corporal Dunn's name, it was in passing, just another NCO on base, with a reputation for being ambitious but careless. I didn't think much of it until one evening in the mess hall when he stopped at my table, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "Hayes," he said, drawing out the syllables like he was testing them. "Small world, isn't it? My Aunt Carla sends her regards." My stomach dropped. In an instant, the fragile sense of safety I had built at Fort Bragg cracked. He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of coffee, and whispered, "She keeps an eye on you even from Charleston. Don't forget that." Then he walked away, leaving his tray untouched. From that day forward, the isolation I had begun to feel solidified into something sharper. Dunn became the bridge between Carla's world and mine, and he wielded it with relish. Whenever I filed a routine report, somehow there were errors that had to be corrected. If I volunteered for an assignment, I was mysteriously reassigned at the last minute. It was never blatant enough to lodge a formal complaint without sounding paranoid, but it was constant, a steady erosion of my credibility. The other soldiers began to notice, though, not in the way I hoped. "Hayes, you've got some bad luck," one specialist joked after my paperwork got lost again. I forced a laugh, but inside I was unraveling. Bad luck wasn't the word. It was sabotage, quiet and efficient, orchestrated by a stepmother who should have had no reach inside a military base. But with Dunn whispering in ears and Carla making calls to family support channels, I was slowly being boxed in. I tried to fight back the only way I knew how, by outworking the narrative. I showed up early, stayed late, pushed my body to exhaustion. But the more I tried to prove myself, the more invisible I became. Dunn made sure of it. He had a way of standing just close enough to remind me of Carla's presence. During drills, I'd feel his eyes on me, and when no one else was around, he'd murmur things like, "She says you'll crack. You always do." Those words echoed my stepmother's voice so clearly it made my chest tighten. The loneliness was suffocating. In the barracks, laughter spilled from rooms I wasn't invited into. In the field, jokes passed over me as though I wasn't there. The army was supposed to be my escape, my family of equals, but instead, Carla had turned it into another stage for her control. I began to doubt myself in ways I swore I never would. Maybe the counselor was right. Maybe I was unstable. Maybe Carla had been right all along. But late at night, lying in my bunk, staring at the ceiling fan, I would remember the vow I made when I left Charleston, that I would never let her silence me again. That vow was the only thread I had left to hold on to. And as Dunn's shadow stretched longer, as Carla's grip tightened even from miles away, a quiet fury began to grow inside me. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way to turn their own tactics against them. It started small, the way most battles do, with moments that seemed petty at first glance, but carried the weight of warning. One evening, I returned to my bunk to find my locker slightly ajar. My uniforms had been pulled out and tossed onto the floor, boots missing toiletries scattered. At first, I thought it was some dumb prank, a barracks joke gone too far. But when I knelt to gather my things, I saw my journal open on the bed, pages crumpled where someone had pressed their fingers down hard. They had read it. The journal was the one place I let myself breathe, the one place I wrote about my mother, about Charleston, about the pain Carla had caused me. Now it had been invaded, and the violation made my hands shake. I wanted to storm down the hall and demand answers, but when I stepped into the corridor, Corporal Dunn was already leaning against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk on his face. "Lose something, Hayes?" he asked, voice casual, but his eyes glinted with something sharper. Maybe keep your little secrets to yourself next time. This is the Army, not a diary circle. He pushed off the wall and walked away before I could answer his laughter echoing down the hallway. That was the beginning of a campaign designed to break me. My boots turned up 2 days later covered in mud and reeking like they'd been dunked in the latrine. My PT shorts were cut at the waistband, so they ripped during morning formation. Every time I tried to report it, the paperwork stalled, went missing, or came back stamped with insufficient evidence. Dunn had allies and I was the target. It escalated quickly. In the showers, I was shoved hard against the tiled wall, the water stinging my back as I gasped for breath. Carter and Miller, the two specialists, who always hovered around Dunn, grinned like it was all a joke. "Relax, Hayes," Carter said, flicking water in my face. "We're just messing with you. Don't take everything so serious." But the bruise on my shoulder told a different story. When I told First Sergeant about it, his only response was, "Boys will be boys, Hayes. Don't stir up trouble." That phrase, "boys will be boys," became the soundtrack of my nights. I heard it in my head as I lay on my bunk, pressing a towel against the swelling on my arm. I heard it when my textbooks were stolen, when my food tray was knocked to the floor in the mess hall, when whispers followed me across the training yard. Each incident alone might have seemed minor, but together they were a systematic dismantling of my place in the platoon. They wanted me gone, and they weren't going to stop until I either quit or broke. One night, it went too far. I was walking back to the barracks from the motor pool, the sky heavy with Carolina humidity, when Carter and Miller flanked me. Dunn followed behind, his voice low and mocking. "You really think you belong here, Hayes? You're just a Project a Charity case. Aunt Carla says you've always been a problem." Before I could react, Carter shoved me into the chain-link fence, the impact rattling through my bones. Miller grabbed my duffel and dumped its contents into the dirt. Dunn crouched close, his knee pressing into my ribs, his voice venomous. "Quit now, Hayes, and maybe we'll let you leave in one piece. Stay and we'll make sure you regret every minute." His words burned hotter than the bruises blooming across my side. When they finally walked away, I stayed slumped against the fence dust, sticking to my sweat-soaked uniform. I wanted to scream, to call someone, to beg for help, but the truth was already clear. Dunn had the chain of command wrapped around his finger. Carla had poisoned the well long before I even stepped foot in Bragg. My voice would be dismissed as exaggeration, my pain minimized to teenage drama. I limped back to my bunk, pressed ice against my ribs, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since I'd joined, I felt the same helplessness that had haunted me in Charleston, the same sense of being trapped in a house built to suffocate me. But then I remembered something my father had told me years ago, back when he was still my protector. In the Army, Hayes, you learn to survive by adapting. If the system won't save you, you find another way. I realized then that survival here wasn't going to come from complaints or appeals. It would come from strategy, from patience, from turning their own arrogance against them. The abuse had escalated, but so had my resolve. The bruises became my constant companions, blooming across my ribs, my arms, sometimes hidden under long sleeves, even in the sticky North Carolina heat. The worst part was not the pain, but the silence that followed the way no one asked, the way everyone seemed to know but chose not to see. One night in the barracks shower room, Carter shoved me so hard that my head cracked against the tile. Stars burst in my vision as I slid to the floor, water cascading over me, while Miller laughed and called it an accident. Dunn bent down close enough that I could smell the sharp sting of his aftershave and whispered, "Careful, Hayes. Slips happen. Maybe you're just clumsy." They left me lying there, the sound of their boots fading while the water pooled around my cheek. When I finally dragged myself back to my bunk, I pressed a wet towel against the swelling and thought about my mother, about the way she had held me once when I scraped my knee as a child, whispering that I was strong. That memory felt like a lifeline, fragile but real. The next morning, I reported to the first sergeant again, determination burning in my chest. I laid out the details, dates times the injuries. He listened with a flat expression, then leaned back in his chair. "Hayes, you need to toughen up. This is the Army, not summer camp. You think I don't hear complaints every day? Boys' roughhouse. You're taking it too personal." I opened my mouth to argue, but his eyes hardened. "That's my final word. Don't bring me gossip again unless you have hard proof." His dismissal crushed something inside me. Walking out of his office, I felt the weight of an entire system pressing down on me. Carla had taught me early that power protects itself. Now I was watching it play out in uniform. By the time I reached the barracks, Dunn was waiting. "Did you enjoy your little chat?" he asked, smirking. "Word travels fast. You should know better than to waste people's time. Aunt Carla says you never learn." That night, I sat on the edge of my bunk staring at the scars of bruises and thinking how easy it would be to believe them, to believe I was weak, a problem destined to break. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall where anyone could see. I slipped into the empty latrine, locked the stall door, and pressed my forehead against the cool metal. The sound of muffled laughter echoed down the hallway, and I thought of Charleston, of all the times Carla had orchestrated scenes where I was humiliated and alone while Victoria thrived. It was the same script, only the stage had changed. For the first time since I enlisted, I questioned whether I had made a mistake. Maybe I had been foolish to believe the army could be an escape. Maybe Carla's reach was infinite, her grip unbreakable. In that moment of despair, I wanted to call my father to hear him say something, anything that proved I wasn't fighting alone. But I already knew what his silence would sound like. So instead, I whispered into the empty stall, "Stand up, Hayes. Stand up again." My voice trembled, but the words were there. I was bruised, bloodied, and alone, but somewhere beneath all of it, a spark still burned. I didn't know how, but I swore to myself that if the system refused to protect me, then I would find a way to protect myself. That vow in the quiet of the latrine was the only shield I had left, but it was enough to keep me breathing, enough to keep me alive until the turning point I could feel coming, even if I didn't yet know when or how it would arrive. The night it all nearly broke me was one of those sweltering Carolina evenings when the air itself felt heavy with menace. I had stayed late at the motor pool finishing inventory, hoping the quiet would give me a moment to collect myself, but when I stepped outside, 3 shadows detached themselves from the edge of the lot. Carter, Miller, and Dunn closed in fast, their boots crunching gravel in a rhythm I would never forget. I tried to sidestep, but Carter shoved me hard into the side of a Humvee, the metal slamming against my shoulder. Pain shot through me, but before I could steady myself, Miller had grabbed my wrist and twisted until I thought the bone would snap. Dunn leaned close, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You never learn, Hayes. You keep talking, you keep trying to fight. Aunt Carla says it's time we teach you once and for all." Then the blows came not wild, but deliberate, methodical, as though they had rehearsed it. A punch to the ribs that stole my breath, a knee, driving into my thigh, my back slammed against the vehicle until I slid to the ground. My head rang with every impact, stars exploding behind my eyes, and for a moment, I thought this was where it would end, in a pool of dust and humiliation under the North Carolina sky. When they finally left, laughing as though it had been nothing more than a game, I lay there gasping, every breath cutting like broken glass. My ribs screamed, my vision blurred, but my mind refused to shut down. I forced myself to crawl inch by inch back toward the barracks, dragging my body across the gravel until my palms were raw. Once inside, I locked myself in the latrine, slumped against the door, and pressed trembling fingers to my side. The pain was sharp and deep. I knew enough from training to suspect a cracked rib may be worse, but I also knew no medic would believe me without a story that fit the narrative Dunn had already poisoned. If I said I fell, they would dismiss me. If I told the truth, they would call it exaggeration. I had been silenced before I even spoke. And yet, sitting there on the cold tile with blood in my mouth, something inside me shifted. The despair was still there, heavy and suffocating, but underneath it, a new current stirred anger focused and cold. I thought about everything Carla had orchestrated from Charleston, how she had turned Dunn into her weapon, how she had bought silence from those who should have protected me. I thought about the laughter of Carter and Miller, the ease with which they hurt me, convinced there would never be consequences. And I realized that surviving was no longer enough. Survival kept me breathing, but it would not stop them. If I wanted to end this, I would have to change the rules. I pulled myself to my feet, wincing as my body protested, and stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face was swollen, my uniform dirty, but my eyes were clear. For the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg, I wasn't just thinking about how to endure. I was thinking about how to strike back. My training had taught me more than how to fire a rifle or march in formation. It had taught me tactics, patience, and the power of gathering intelligence. These men thought I was weak, just another target. They had underestimated me the way Carla always had. That was their mistake. I whispered to myself again the words, steadier now. Stand up, Hayes. Stand up and fight. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a promise. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I felt the first seeds of a plan beginning to take root. If they wanted a war, I would give them one on my terms. It wasn't long after that night at the motor pool that I began to see Carla's fingerprints more clearly. She had always been skilled at pulling strings quietly, but now she was bold, as though convinced that distance and my uniform could never shield me from her reach. The first sign was when I tried to file a formal medical report about my injuries. The medic on duty glanced at my ribs pressed lightly and nodded with professional concern. "These look bad. Could be a fracture," he said. I thought for once the system might take me seriously. But when the report reached the company office, it came back altered. Instead of suspected rib fracture due to assault, it read mild bruising sustained during physical training. My jaw clenched as I read the line. That was Dunn's hand at work, subtle but devastating. 2 days later, I overheard Dunn laughing with Carter in the mess hall. Paperwork disappears easy when the right people get paid. Aunt Carla takes care of family. His voice carried just enough for me to hear. My stomach turned not from fear this time, but from fury. Carla was funneling money into Dunn's family, probably disguised as loans or gifts, ensuring his loyalty. In return, he protected her by protecting Victoria's narrative. Amanda Hayes was the unstable one, the jealous one, the problem child. It was Charleston all over again, but in uniform. Even higher up, the echoes of her influence were felt. Captain Reynolds, my commanding officer, called me into his office one afternoon. His expression was polite but distant, the way someone looks when they've already decided the conversation's outcome. "Private Hayes," he began, "I've received communications from your stepmother. She seems concerned about your adjustment to Army life." I felt the blood rush to my ears. "Sir, with respect, Carla Hayes is not my guardian. She has no role in my service record." He held up his hand as if to silence me. "Be that as it may, she's reached out through the family support network, and it would be unwise for you to ignore the optics. Perception matters, Hayes. Perception. That was Carla's favorite weapon. She had perfected the art of looking like the caring stepmother while planting seeds of doubt. I left his office shaking with anger, but also with clarity. Carla's money and whispers had built a wall around me. Any complaint I made was twisted into evidence of my supposed instability. Any injury I reported became accidental. Every attempt to be heard was drowned out by the same chorus I'd known since I was a child: Amanda is the problem. But this time, I wasn't a powerless girl in Charleston. I had training, I had discipline, and I had something Carla didn't know: I was building resolve. That night, lying awake on my bunk, I realized that proving my worth through extra laps and long hours would never be enough. Carla had changed the battlefield. If I wanted to fight back, I had to change the strategy. Evidence was my only weapon now. And unlike the bruises that faded or the words twisted into lies, evidence could speak louder than Carla's influence. I didn't know how yet, not with the strict rules against recording, but the seed was planted. If I could gather proof, real proof, I could turn her weapons back on her. The weeks that followed confirmed just how far Carla was willing to go. A rumor spread through the platoon that I had lashed out at another soldier during training, that I was unstable, even dangerous. At first, I thought it was just idle talk until Lieutenant Ramirez pulled me aside. "Hayes off the record," he said quietly. "You need to be careful. Stories are circulating. People are saying you're aggressive, maybe unfit for service." His eyes softened slightly. "I don't believe it, but others do." My fists tightened at my sides. It was exactly the narrative Carla wanted, one that made me sound like a liability instead of a victim. I confronted Dunn in the hallway after formation. "You're spreading lies," I said through clenched teeth. He leaned casually against the wall, that same smirk plastered on his face. "Relax, Hayes. I'm just telling people what they already suspect. Aunt Carla says perception is reality, and right now, everyone thinks you're unstable. Prove them wrong if you can." He walked away, leaving me trembling with rage, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. I began documenting everything. Every bruise, every threat, every missing piece of gear. I kept a private log, writing down dates and times with military precision. When Carter shoved me in the mess line and spilled food down my uniform, I noted it. When Miller cornered me in the hallway and hissed insults under his breath, I noted that too. My body was covered in marks they thought would vanish without a trace, but I was building a record that would not. It was during this time that I found an unexpected ally. Staff Sergeant Whitaker, a grizzled veteran of Iraq, noticed me icing my ribs one night after drills. He didn't ask right away, just watched with the wary eyes of someone who had seen too much. Finally, he said, "Hayes, you remind me of a kid I knew downrange. Took beatings, kept quiet, thought no one would believe him. You know what saved him?" I shook my head. Whitaker leaned closer. Evidence. He started writing everything down, recording voices when he could, and when the time came, no one could deny the truth. "You've got that look, Hayes, like someone carrying a weight too heavy to hold alone." I hesitated. Recording was against regulation, but the idea gnawed at me. If I could catch Dunn and the others in their own words, if I could build a case they couldn't bury, maybe I could finally break Carla's grip. Whitaker must have seen the conflict in my face because he added, "There's more than one way to get evidence. Just be smart. The truth has power if you know how to wield it." That night, as I tucked my small phone deeper into my duffel, I felt the spark of rebellion catch fire. Carla thought she had silenced me forever, that her money and Dunn's loyalty would erase every bruise, every humiliation. She had no idea I was preparing a record of her sins, one line at a time, one bruise at a time. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing for war, and this time I would not fight on her terms. It happened during a late-night training rotation, one of those exercises designed to test our endurance when exhaustion was already clawing at our bodies. We had been running drills for hours, sweat soaking through our uniforms, rifles heavy against our shoulders. I was pushing through the fatigue, repeating to myself that every mile was proof I belonged here when I felt the shove from behind. It was too deliberate, too forceful to be an accident. My boot caught on a root and I went down hard, the impact slamming into my chest. Pain exploded across my ribs, sharper than anything I had felt before. I gasped for air, but it came shallow and ragged, every inhale a stab of fire. The world spun, voices blurred. Carter's laugh cut through the haze. "Clumsy Hayes strikes again." I tried to rise, but Miller leaned down, his voice low and mocking. "Maybe you should just quit before you get yourself killed." Then Dunn appeared in my peripheral vision, crouching so his face was inches from mine. "Aunt Carla says you never did know when to stop. Maybe this will teach you." He pressed his knee against my side, right where the pain was searing, and I bit back a scream. Then they moved on, leaving me in the dirt, like discarded gear. I don't know how long I lay there before someone helped me back toward the barracks, but by the time I collapsed on my bunk, I knew something inside had cracked. The medic the next morning confirmed what I already suspected: fractured ribs, strict orders to rest. On paper, it was written as training accident. My protest was ignored. My words erased before they even reached the page. That night, as I tried to breathe through the stabbing pain, despair nearly swallowed me. I thought about Charleston, about all the times Carla had engineered my humiliation and silenced my voice. I thought about my father's silence, about Victoria's smug smile. And now, here I was, a soldier with fractured ribs, laughed at by the very people who were supposed to be my brothers and sisters in arms. But as the hours dragged on, something began to shift. Pain has a way of sharpening the mind, stripping everything down to its core. In the darkness of the barracks, clutching my side, I realized I had reached the end of endurance. Survival had kept me alive this long, but survival wasn't enough anymore. If I stayed in this cycle of silence and erasure, I would break. They would make sure of it. The only way forward was to stop playing their game and start playing mine. I remembered Whitaker's words about evidence, about the power of truth when wielded correctly. I thought of the quiet log I had been keeping, the bruises photographed in secret, the dates and times scrawled with military precision. Alone, they were fragile threads. But woven together, they could become a net strong enough to trap even Carla and Dunn. For the first time, I felt not just anger, but strategy rising in me. I had discipline, I had training, and I had the one thing: they underestimated patience. Lying there, I made myself a vow. I would stop reacting to their provocations with pain and despair. Instead, I would observe record and prepare. Every shove, every insult, every stolen possession would become ammunition. Every whisper Dunn dropped about Carla would be a nail in her coffin. They thought they had broken me, but all they had done was forge a weapon sharper than they could imagine. The next day, moving slowly with my rib strapped, I began putting the vow into action. I kept my head down, nodding when they mocked me, letting them believe I was beaten. Inside, I was cataloging every word, every move. When Dunn hissed, "Weak little Hayes," I smiled faintly and wrote it down later. When Carter tripped me in the chow line, I logged the time, the witnesses, the bruise. Miller's smirk, Dunn's threats, Carla's letters, all of it became part of a growing arsenal I was determined to unleash when the moment came. At night, when the pain kept me awake, I whispered to myself the mantra that had carried me through basic training. Stand up, Hayes. Stand up again. Only now the words meant something more. They weren't just about endurance. They were about transformation. I wasn't standing up to survive. I was standing up to fight back, to turn every scar into proof, every humiliation into fuel. One evening, Whitaker caught me limping back from the range. His eyes narrowed, taking in the bandages under my uniform. They did it again, didn't they? I didn't answer, but the silence was enough. He studied me for a long moment, then said quietly, "You've got more grit than most people I've served with. Don't waste it. Use it." His words struck deep, not as comfort, but as a challenge. Use it. That was exactly what I intended to do. By the end of that week, the despair that had nearly crushed me had transformed into something harder, colder. I knew now that I could not rely on the chain of command, not when Carla's money and Dunn's influence poisoned every report. But I also knew that systems, no matter how rigged, had cracks, and I was determined to find them. My fractured rib was not the end. It was the turning point. It was the moment Amanda Hayes stopped being their target and started becoming their reckoning. The rib healed slowly, each breath still reminding me of what they had done, but I carried that pain like a signal flare. It reminded me I was no longer just enduring, I was preparing. The first step was to treat every interaction as potential evidence. I knew the rules against recording were strict, but I also knew that once the truth came into the right hands, it could not be ignored. So I learned to be subtle. I kept my phone tucked deep in my duffel, switching it on only when I was sure it could capture their words without being seen. Late at night, when Dunn and his pack gathered near the barracks to brag, I sat quietly nearby, letting the audio roll. At first, the clips were short, muffled laughter and fragments of threats, but even those were more than I had before. I paired the audio with photographs, small, grainy snapshots of bruises, cuts, torn uniforms. I took them quickly in the latrine mirror, careful not to draw attention. Each image carried a date and time, and I logged everything with military precision in my journal. March 4th, 2200 hours bruise on left shoulder from shove by Carter during chow line. March 7th, 100 hours Dunn overheard referencing Carla's payment. The log grew thicker each week, a record of cruelty so systematic it could no longer be dismissed as accidents or gossip. But I needed allies. Evidence alone wouldn't be enough if it came from just me. The system had already labeled me unstable thanks to Carla's whispers. That was when I approached Whitaker. I waited until we were alone after drills, his broad frame silhouetted against the fading Carolina sky. "Staff Sergeant," I said quietly, "I've been keeping a record. I need someone who can help me make sure it isn't buried." His eyes narrowed, studying me, but instead of dismissal, I saw recognition. "Show me," he said. That night in the privacy of his office, I laid it all out: the photos, the journal, the audio files. His jaw tightened as he read, his hands curling into fists. "Damn," he muttered, "they've been building a wall around you." He flipped through the journal again, then looked at me squarely. "Hayes, this is the kind of thing JAG can't ignore if it's presented right. But you've got to be careful. If they catch wind of what you're doing, they'll double down. I nodded, my voice steady. I'm ready. I just need to know how to move without them seeing. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. Start small. Don't chase every insult. Focus on the stuff that shows patterns, injuries, money threats. Build a chain they can't break. And Hayes. He paused. Don't let your anger get ahead of your strategy. They want you reckless. Don't give them that. For the first time in months, I felt the crushing weight of isolation lift slightly. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally who understood not just my pain, but the battlefield it had created. The counterattack had begun not with fists or rage, but with patience and precision. And this time, I would not miss my target. Once I had Whitaker's quiet support, my next step was not just to gather evidence, but to shift the balance of power. Dunn and his cronies thrived on the belief that I was cornered helpless with nowhere to run. If I could shake that belief even just a little, it might cause cracks in their confidence. That was when I decided to use something the Army had already taught me: psychological warfare. It started with whispers. One night in the mess hall, as Carter shoved past me, I muttered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Funny thing about cameras, they catch more than people realize." He froze for a half second, his tray clattering as he moved away. I didn't elaborate, didn't give him anything concrete to latch onto, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The next day, Miller avoided me during drills, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to be watching. I hadn't installed a single hidden camera, but the suggestion was enough to plant doubt. Dunn, of course, wasn't so easily shaken. He confronted me outside the barracks, his smile sharp. "You think you're clever, Hayes, spreading rumors about cameras. You're playing a dangerous game." I looked him straight in the eye and said calmly, "Maybe I'm not the one playing anymore." Then I walked away, leaving the silence heavy behind me. He didn't laugh this time. Meanwhile, my evidence file grew. With Whitaker's advice, I focused on building patterns. I recorded snippets of Dunn bragging about Carla's money, Carter making cruel jokes about my bruises, Miller threatening to make me disappear. I paired the recordings with detailed logs and photographs. It became a map of abuse, one that no officer could ignore if it was placed in front of them all at once. To tighten the noose further, I started slipping bits of disinformation into casual conversation. During a late-night barracks cleaning, I mentioned to another soldier within earshot of Dunn Funny how supply logs are tracked so carefully these days. Even personal purchases get flagged if they look suspicious. I said it casually, as though it was general knowledge. The next day, I saw Dunn pulling Carter aside, their heads bent in anxious conversation. I had no proof yet of the money flowing from Carla, but Dunn didn't know how much I knew. Letting him believe I might have more than I did was part of the strategy. The tension began to show. Carter's jokes grew sharper but less confident, as though he was trying to convince himself. Miller drank more at the mess, his hands trembling slightly. Dunn remained outwardly calm, but his eyes followed me constantly, now wary instead of mocking. The more they tried to corner me, the more they began to wonder if someone else was watching someone they couldn't silence. And that was exactly what I wanted. For years, Carla had thrived on control, manipulating perception until I was painted as the unstable one. Now I was flipping the script. By planting seeds of doubt by letting them stew in their own paranoia, I was turning their tactics against them. Each whisper, each carefully dropped word, each piece of evidence tucked safely away brought me closer to the moment when I would finally strike. The real breakthrough came one night when Dunn grew careless. He and Carter were arguing outside the barracks, their voices rising over who was supposed to handle me during training. I had slipped my phone into the pocket of my PT shorts, the recorder already running, and sat on my bunk near the open window. Dunn's words cut sharp through the humid night air. "Aunt Carla didn't send that money for you to screw this up. If Hayes goes crying to command again, it's on both of us. Keep her in line." Carter muttered something in response, but it didn't matter. I had what I needed, his admission in his own voice tying Carla directly to their actions. My pulse raced as I listened back later, my hands shaking with the weight of it. For years, Carla had controlled the narrative. Now, I had hers. I took it to Whitaker the next day, waiting until we were alone in the motor pool office. He listened to the recording twice, jaw tight, eyes dark. When it ended, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. This is enough to get Jag interested, Hayes. But it's not enough to win outright. They'll try to claim it's doctored, taken out of context, anything to protect their own. He tapped the table. We need corroboration, documentation that lines up with this. That became our mission. With Whitaker's guidance, I started weaving the threads tighter. He helped me organize my logs into official-looking reports with times, dates, and language that mirrored Army standards. He even quietly connected me with a sympathetic JAG contact, someone he trusted from his deployments. The contact couldn't intervene yet, not without risking exposure, but they coached Whitaker on what evidence would stand in a hearing and what would be dismissed as circumstantial. Chain of custody matters, Whitaker warned me. If you've got audio, pair it with your logs, pair it with photographs. Make it airtight. So I became meticulous. Every new bruise, every piece of gear stolen, every whisper from Dunn or his lackeys went into the growing file. Sometimes it felt like I was living two lives, one where I played the beaten-down soldier, quiet and submissive, and another where I was building a case sharp enough to cut through Carla's web. It was exhausting, but it gave me purpose. Each entry in my log was a small act of rebellion, proof that I wasn't broken, not yet. But the risks grew with every step. One evening, Miller nearly caught me snapping a photo of a bruise on my ribs in the latrine mirror. He squinted at me, suspicion in his eyes, but I forced a casual laugh. Sending it to my cousin, he thinks Army training is easy. Just proving him wrong. Miller snorted, half convinced, but the encounter left me rattled. If they discovered the truth before I was ready, all of this would vanish in a storm of destroyed evidence and false charges. Still, the stakes were worth it. I thought of Carla back in Charleston, sipping wine smug in the belief that she had silenced me forever. I thought of Dunn smirking as he twisted my pain into a joke. And I thought of my mother, whose memory had been buried under Carla's lies for too long. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about proving that truth, once armed with discipline and evidence, could cut through any wall of money or influence. The file was nearly ready. Soon it would no longer be my secret. Soon the silence would break. By the time spring rolled into the Carolina heat, I knew the file was nearly complete. The logs filled a notebook, photographs were backed up on a hidden drive, and the audio recordings painted a portrait of Dunn and Carla's conspiracy too detailed to ignore. What I needed now was one final piece, something undeniable, something so direct they couldn't twist it away with excuses. That opportunity came when Dunn's arrogance finally overstepped. During a late-night inspection, he cornered me in the supply room, Carter and Miller lingering near the door. He leaned in close, the smell of stale coffee on his breath, and hissed, "You think you're clever, Hayes. You think your little act fools anyone. Aunt Carla says, if you don't shut up soon, she'll make sure you disappear from this army just like you disappeared from your family." His words were venom, but his timing was careless. My phone was already running in my pocket, tucked beneath the folds of my cargo pants. For once, fear didn't choke me. Instead, I felt an icy calm. His own arrogance had handed me the missing piece. The next day, I slipped the recording to Whitaker. He listened, his face hardening with every second. When it ended, he set the phone down slowly and met my eyes. "This is it, Hayes. This ties her to you directly. With your logs, the photos, the earlier audio, they can't bury this." My chest tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of what came next. There would be no going back once I handed this over to Jag. The Army doesn't tolerate scandals lightly, and Carla's money and influence would not go quietly. If I moved forward, I wasn't just risking my career. I was declaring open war on my stepmother and every ally she had woven into her web. That night, lying awake in my bunk, I played the recording again, letting Dunn's words echo in the silence. "Disappear from this army just like you disappeared from your family." He thought it was a threat. To me, it was confirmation that everything I had endured was real, not paranoia, not exaggeration. I wasn't unstable. I wasn't weak. I was a soldier standing in the middle of a battlefield, and I finally had my weapon. I spent the following days organizing the evidence into a format that mirrored official reports. Dates lined up with medical logs, photographs paired with journal entries, audio clips labeled with timestamps. Whitaker reviewed everything, his corrections blunt but invaluable. "Keep it factual," he reminded me. Don't let emotion cloud the presentation. The facts are damning enough. His words echoed in my head as I worked through the nights polishing the file until it gleamed with precision. When the dossier was finished, I stared at it for a long time. This stack of evidence wasn't just paper and files. It was my survival. My truth, every bruise and insult transformed into a weapon sharp enough to cut through Carla's lies. I tucked it into a sealed envelope labeled and ready for the JAG officer Whitaker had quietly arranged for me to meet. My hands trembled as I pressed it closed, not from doubt, but from the knowledge that once this left my hands, my life would never be the same. As I prepared to deliver it, I felt the weight of both fear and freedom pressing on me. Carla had built her power on silence, on controlling the story before anyone else could speak, but soon the story would be mine to tell and hers to answer for. The day of the hearing at Fort Bragg felt like stepping onto another battlefield. The hall where JAG convened was austere, all sharp edges and muted colors, a place built to strip away excuses. I sat at the long wooden table, my hands folded the sealed envelope of evidence already in the hands of the officers presiding. My uniform was pressed, my boots polished, but beneath the surface my ribs still ached from old injuries. Every mark on my body was part of the story that now lay ready to be told. Dunn entered first, flanked by Carter and Miller. Their swagger had dimmed since whispers of the hearing began, but they still carried themselves with arrogance, smirks tugging at their lips. Behind them came Carla, dressed not for a hearing but for a performance. Her pearl necklace gleamed, her hair styled to perfection, her expression carefully crafted into one of maternal concern. She looked like every civilian spouse who ever played the role of supportive family. Only I knew the venom behind that mask. When the proceedings began, the JAG officer Colonel Pierce laid out the charges: harassment, assault, falsifying reports, obstruction. His voice was calm but firm, the kind that brooked no nonsense. Dunn shifted in his seat. Miller swallowed hard, but Carla never flinched. She leaned forward as though she was about to defend her daughter against some unfair accusation. I was called to speak first. As I rose, my legs felt heavy, but my voice was steady. I laid out the facts just as Whitaker had coached me dates, times, incidents. I described the bruises, the injuries, the systematic isolation. At first, the room was quiet but skeptical, the way people always were when I spoke against Carla's narrative. But then Colonel Pierce opened the envelope and began to play the recordings. Dunn's voice filled the room, arrogant and careless. "Aunt Carla didn't send that money for you to screw this up." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Carter shifted in his chair, his face draining of color. Carla's expression flickered a crack in her perfect mask. The second recording played Dunn threatening me in the supply room. "She'll make sure you disappear from this army just like you disappeared from your family." Gasps echoed across the hall. I watched the officers' faces harden, watched the whispers ripple through the room. For the first time, the weight wasn't on me to prove I wasn't lying. The proof was right there, undeniable, even to those who wanted to look away. I felt my heart hammering, but I stood straighter. This was the moment I had fought for, the moment silence was broken. The defense wasted no time in striking back. Dunn's lawyer, a sharp-suited man with a voice honed for courtroom drama, rose and tried to turn the tide. "What we've heard are selective recordings taken out of context," he declared, glancing toward the officers as though daring them to disagree. Private Hayes clearly harbored resentment toward her stepmother. These so-called pieces of evidence are nothing more than attempts to punish a family dispute by dragging it into the Army's halls. Carla clasped her hands in a performance of wounded dignity. "Amanda has always misunderstood me," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to echo in the chamber. "I never wanted her to suffer. If she claims I gave Dunn money, it was to support him as a young man in service, not to hurt her. She twists everything. She always has." I felt the familiar sting, the same twisted narrative Carla had spun since I was a child. Amanda is jealous, Amanda is unstable. Amanda misremembers. For a moment, the old doubt threatened to creep in. But then Whitaker rose from his seat in the gallery. His voice was calm, clipped, and carried the authority of years in combat zones. "With respect, ma'am, I personally verified the chain of custody for these files. I checked timestamps, metadata, and locations. They are authentic and they align perfectly with medical documentation of Private Hayes's injuries." He placed a folder on the table. Inside were photographs. My ribs mottled purple, my lip split bruises circling my arms where I had been grabbed. Each photo bore a date, a signature, a clear marker that erased doubt. Colonel Pierce leaned forward. Sergeant Whitaker, are you willing to state under oath that these documents and recordings have not been tampered with? Whitaker didn't blink. Yes, sir. I would stake my career on their authenticity. The lawyer faltered, trying to pivot. But motives, Colonel, we must consider motives. Why would a woman's own stepmother conspire in such a manner? Surely we cannot believe that family would deliberately sabotage family. Carla seized the lifeline. Her voice trembled as she leaned toward the microphone. I only wanted Amanda to succeed. She was troubled, emotional. I worried she wasn't fit for military life, and I may have shared those fears with Dunn, but that was out of love. These accusations are meant to destroy me. I met her eyes across the room. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. Out of love, I asked, my voice clear, steady, every syllable measured. Out of love, you erased my reports. Out of love, you paid Dunn to silence me. Out of love, you let your husband's daughter bleed in a barracks shower while you polished your pearls at home. Carla's mask cracked. For the briefest second, rage flashed sharp and raw before she rearranged her features. But it was too late. The officers had seen it. The room had seen it. And the narrative she had spun for so long was unraveling thread by thread. The room had shifted. I could feel it in the air like the pressure before a storm. Dunn was sweating through his uniform, his jaw clenched, tight eyes darting toward Carla as if waiting for her to feed him the next line. Colonel Pierce gave him no time to gather himself. Corporal Dunn, stand. Dunn rose reluctantly, his chair scraping across the floor with a sound that made the room wince. Pierce's voice was low, deliberate. You have heard testimony, seen documents, and listened to your own words played aloud. Do you deny that you coordinated with your Aunt Mrs. Carla Hayes to suppress reports filed by Private Hayes Dunn's lawyer, jumped in? Corporal Dunn is under extreme stress, but Pierce cut him off. Corporal, answer the question. Silence stretched until it seemed to press against the walls. Then Dunn cracked. His voice broke barely more than a whisper. I didn't want to. She told me I had to, that if I didn't, the family would turn their back on me. Murmurs rippled across the room. Carla shot to her feet, her pearls clattering against the table. That's a lie, she spat, her composure finally fracturing. You coward! You'd throw me to the wolves to save yourself. Dunn turned toward her, his face pale but resolute now. You said it was about keeping the family's reputation clean. You told me to fix the reports to make Amanda look unstable, to bury anything that could embarrass us. You sent money. Don't you dare pretend otherwise. The hall went utterly still. Carla's mask was gone, replaced by fury that boiled over. She pointed at me, her voice sharp and shrill. She's the problem. Always has been. If she had just listened, none of this would have happened. The sight of her unraveling before uniformed officers who had believed in structure and discipline all their lives was more powerful than any file I could have presented. Colonel Pierce's gaze was unyielding. Mrs. Hayes, your outburst and the testimony we've just heard make it clear. Your influence extended far beyond personal opinion. This was calculated interference, he signaled to the bailiff. Escort her out. She is no longer a credible witness. Carla's protests echoed down the corridor even as the door closed behind her. I sat very still, my pulse hammering, realizing what had just happened. Years of silence and manipulation had collapsed in minutes, undone by evidence and her own arrogance. Pierce turned his focus back to Dunn. You have confessed to altering official reports under pressure from a civilian. That is a grave breach of duty. Do you have anything further to say? Dunn shook his head, shoulders sagging, the weight of his choices crushing him at last. For the first time since I had walked into that chamber, I felt the scales begin to balance. Not fully, not yet, but enough to know that truth had finally broken through. Enough to know the battle was no longer mine alone to fight. The verdict came swiftly. Once the room cleared of Carla's protests and Dunn's trembling admissions, the JAG panel deliberated for less than an hour. In military terms, that was lightning fast. The facts were no longer tangled by whispers or buried by falsified reports. The evidence spoke with brutal clarity. When the officers returned, their faces carried the solemn weight of justice delivered. Colonel Pierce's voice echoed through the chamber. "Corporal Dunn, Specialist Miller, Private Carter, stand." The three men shuffled to their feet, each one carrying the look of someone who finally realized privilege would not save them. "This court finds you guilty of conduct unbecoming assault and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Effective immediately, you are reduced in rank, sentenced to confinement, and will be dishonorably discharged upon completion of your terms." Dunn's shoulders collapsed. Miller cursed under his breath, earning a sharp reprimand. Carter stared blankly ahead, his face drained of all color. Years of arrogance of smirks in the barracks and casual cruelty had led them here. Now their futures dissolved into prison walls and a discharge that would shadow them for the rest of their lives. Carla was dealt her own blow. The civilian liaison from the Department of Justice stepped forward, documents in hand. "Mrs. Carla Hayes, by order of federal warrant, you are under arrest for bribery and obstruction of justice." The handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the silent room. For a moment, she looked at me not with remorse, not even with hatred, but with disbelief, as though she couldn't fathom a world where her power had failed her. She was led out past the rows of uniforms, the pearls at her neck rattling like the last remnants of a facade that had finally cracked. News of the hearing spread across Fort Bragg faster than I could have imagined. By evening, whispers had become headlines in the base newsletter, "Corporal convicted in cover-up scandal." For once, my name was not buried beneath slander. It stood attached to words like integrity and courage. Fellow soldiers I had once feared walking past in the mess hall now offered quiet nods of respect. Staff Sergeant Whitaker clasped my shoulder with the kind of grip that says more than words. "You did what most couldn't. You fought back and you won." The Army, ever eager to correct its image once exposed, moved swiftly. Dunn, Miller, and Carter were shipped to confinement within the week. Carla faced arraignment in federal court, her frozen smile plastered across local news stations as she entered the courthouse in handcuffs. Victoria, the stepsister who had thrived off Carla's schemes, watched her world crumble too. Her scholarship, funded in part through money Carla siphoned, was revoked. The social media posts flaunting her new car and designer clothes vanished overnight. For once, I didn't feel envy. I felt release. Richard Hayes, my father, came to me quietly. He looked older, worn down the lines in his face, carved deeper than I remembered. We met in the base chapel, away from cameras, away from the hum of gossip. His voice trembled. "Amanda, I failed you. I let Carla define who you were to me, and I believed her lies because it was easier than facing my own guilt. I'm sorry. For years, I had imagined this moment, craving it, rehearsing what I might scream. Instead, I looked at him and felt the weight lifting. You let her hurt me," I said softly, not as accusation, but as fact. He nodded, tears in his eyes, "And I can't undo it. But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." The apology did not erase the years of silence, but it cracked something open. For the first time, I felt the possibility of healing, not just survival, but something deeper. Recognition came formally a month later. In a small ceremony on the parade field, I was called forward by Captain Reynolds. He looked at me differently now, not as a liability whispered about in back offices, but as a soldier who had held the line under fire. For courage in the face of adversity and for demonstrating integrity under fire, Private First Class Amanda Hayes is hereby promoted to sergeant. The applause that followed was not loud, but it was steady, respectful, genuine. I stood taller as the chevrons were pinned to my uniform. The bruises had faded, the scars remained, but my voice was stronger than it had ever been. Healing was not instant. Nightmares still came, sometimes vivid, sometimes faint echoes of fists and taunts in the barracks. But now when I woke, it wasn't to silence. It was to the knowledge that I had fought back, that I had won not only for myself, but for anyone who had been told to stay quiet. Letters began arriving from strangers, other women in uniform, parents of daughters, even retired veterans. They told me my stand had given them courage, that my fight had lit something in them. Each letter felt like a balm, a reminder that pain, when faced, could ripple outward into something larger than me. I found myself at Arlington months later, standing among rows of white headstones. Not because I had lost someone newly, but because I needed the reminder of what sacrifice was meant to mean. The air was cool, the silence heavy yet cleansing. I thought about the girl who had sat bruised in a barracks shower, convinced she was invisible. I thought about the young woman standing here now, her name no longer a whisper of shame, but a marker of resilience. For the first time in years, I let myself cry, not from fear, but from freedom. Justice had not come perfectly. Nothing could erase the past. But Carla's arrest, Dunn's disgrace, and my own rise from silence to sergeant proved something undeniable, even in the darkest corners where corruption and cruelty hid truth could break through. And when it did, it burned everything false to ash. The months that followed felt like a second kind of training. Not the rigid drills of the army or the silent endurance of abuse, but something harder in its own way, learning how to breathe without fear. For so long, survival had been my only mission. Now, for the first time, I was allowed to think about what came after. I still carried the weight of memories. Barracks showers where bruises bloomed across my skin. Carla's voice over the phone dismissing me as unstable. Dunn's threats whispered like promises in the night. But those memories no longer had the power to define me. They were scars, not shackles. And scars told stories of survival, not surrender. One morning, standing in front of the mirror in my quarters, I caught sight of the faint line across my lip where it had split months before. Instead of turning away, I leaned closer. For years, I had hated my reflection, seeing only the girl who never measured up to Carla's standards, who was erased in every family photo, who was told to be quiet while Victoria shined. But now I saw something else, a young woman who had endured and refused to break. A soldier not because the army had made me one, but because life had demanded it of me long before I put on the uniform. Letters and emails began to arrive in a steady stream. A mother in Kansas wrote that her daughter had been bullied at school and that hearing my story gave the girl courage to tell a teacher. A retired Army nurse from Texas said she had been silenced decades ago when she tried to report harassment, and watching me stand before JAG gave her closure she had never thought possible. A high school student from Ohio admitted she was scared to enlist, but now she believed strength didn't mean silence. Each message became part of my healing proof that what had nearly destroyed me could instead become a force for others. It was at Arlington National Cemetery that the final shift came. I had gone alone, walking among the rows of white headstones that stretched into the horizon. The air carried a stillness that pressed into my chest. I stopped at one stone that belonged to a woman I had never met, a soldier who had died before her 20th birthday. I placed my hand on the cool marble and whispered, "We're still fighting, and because of you, I could keep fighting too." Tears slid down my face, but they were not the tears of fear that once soaked my pillow at night. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of freedom. That evening, I received a message from a young private just entering training at Fort Jackson. "Sergeant Hayes," she wrote, "I don't know you personally, but your story reached me. I was ready to quit. Now I think I'll stay. Because if you could stand up to all that and still wear the uniform with pride, maybe I can too." I sat for a long time staring at her words. It hit me then with a force stronger than any punishment handed down to Carla or Dunn. My fight had never been only about me. It had been about every girl told her pain didn't matter, every soldier silenced for the sake of reputation, every victim whose truth was buried under someone else's power. When I finally closed my eyes that night, I slept deeply. No nightmares, no jolts awake in the dark. Just rest. Real rest. I wasn't naive. I knew there would always be people like Carla, always systems that tried to protect predators instead of victims. But I also knew something else now. Silence was never the answer, and fear was never the end. I had stood in the fire, and I had come out not just alive, but stronger. As I walked across base the next morning, the sun rising over the parade field, I caught sight of new recruits jogging in formation. Their chants echoed sharp and alive, carried by voices that hadn't yet been tested by betrayal. One of them looked over, recognizing me, and gave a small nod of respect. I returned it knowing that the fight I had endured had already made the path a little safer for her and for those who would come after. I thought of Carla, then her pearls clattering as she was led away, her mask finally shattered. For years, she had tried to convince me I was powerless, that no one would ever believe me. But the truth had prevailed. Justice had been served, and I had reclaimed the one thing she could never touch again: my voice. If you've ever stood alone against family, against power, against a system that told you to be silent, know this: you are not alone. I carried my truth into the light, and it changed everything. You can too. If you've followed me through this story, you know it was never just about bruises in a barracks or the sound of handcuffs on Carla's wrists. It was about every moment of silence forced onto me, every time someone told me to keep my head down for the sake of appearances, every time a predator was protected because of a family name. And I know I am not the only one who has lived that kind of silence. Many of you watching have carried stories in your own families, in your workplaces, maybe even in your churches or communities, stories of people who thought power gave them the right to hurt and the right to hide. I want to speak directly to you now, especially those of you over 50 who have seen decades of change, but also decades of secrets swept under the rug. What do you think when you hear about a stepmother using influence to bury the truth, or a family member sacrificing another just to keep their reputation intact? Have you seen something like that in your own life? If so, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment below and tell me what stood out to you, what made you angry, and what made you hopeful. And if you believe, like I do, that justice is never about revenge but about protecting the innocent and making sure the guilty face real consequences, then let's make this conversation bigger. Hit like so more people can find this story. Subscribe if you want more true accounts of betrayal and resilience. And most importantly, share this with someone who might need the reminder that silence does not have to be the end of their story. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone take it from you.